Well, jurors in the criminal fraud trial of Elizabeth Holmes just reached their verdict. Our Scott Cohn live outside the courthouse in San Jose. Scott, what's the story?
Kelly, this verdict is being read as we speak, and it is a mixed verdict in addition to being a partial verdict. Elizabeth Holmes found guilty of conspiracy to defraud Theranos investors, not guilty of conspiracy to defraud Theranos patients. The jury could not reach a verdict on 3 counts of wire fraud against Theranos investors. 3 investors. They include Alan Eisenman, who testified in the trial, the Black Diamond Ventures hedge fund, and the Hall Group. No verdict on that count, but guilty on wire fraud against PFM, that's a healthcare hedge fund, and guilty of defrauding the family office of Betsy DeVos, the DeVos family, which had invested $100 million into the company. She is also found guilty of wire fraud against Daniel Mosley, who was an attorney who was introduced to the company by his client Henry Kissinger, who was on the board. But she is acquitted on the counts of defrauding Theranos patients. So, again, a mixed verdict and unable to reach a verdict on 3 of the counts of wire fraud. It will now be up to the government to decide if they're going to retry her on those counts of wire fraud and really where they go from here. It is certainly a partial victory for the government. Elizabeth Holmes still could face 20 years in prison just on the wire fraud counts, but we'll see where it goes from here. The then sequel to this is a trial expected to begin in February of Sunny Balwani, who was the chief operating officer, someone who Elizabeth Holmes blamed for a lot of the problems at the blood testing company, also her former boyfriend. And so this complicates the government's strategy in that case as well. We're continuing to evaluate this. Our producer in the courtroom, Yasmin Korum, says that the atmosphere was tense as the verdicts were read. The jurors did not make eye contact with Holmes, who sat upright as she has throughout this trial. But again, Elizabeth Holmes in a mixed verdict, but convicted of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and convicted of wire fraud substantively against Theranos investors.
But
Kelly?
again, Scott, it sounds like she was convicted on the investment fraud, but not convicted on the patient fraud. What are the implications in terms of her potential sentences?
Well, a couple of things. The conspiracy, both conspiracy counts carried 5-year sentence, so she's been acquitted on one of those and convicted on the other. So it may be sort of a wash as far as the sentencing goes. But the interesting thing is this case of defrauding Theranos patients. The government was limited somewhat in the kinds of evidence that it could bring in this regard. And in fact, one of the counts they had to dismiss on their own, basically because of more or less sort of a clerical error in how they presented the case and what was in the indictment versus what was argued in the case. So that was, if anything, I suppose, and maybe the verdict bears this out, the weaker part of the government's case. But remember, Elizabeth Holmes raised some $900 million from some very smart, very prominent, very bright investors. And the jury is saying here that at least in some of those cases, that was flat out fraud, that she lied to them about the capabilities of the company and the contracts that it supposedly had with the military. In fact, there were no contracts, and really where it was going. This company that she said was going to change the world, but it wound up collapsing after a series of damning articles in the Wall Street Journal back in 2015.
All right, Scott, thanks again. Our Scott Cohn right outside the courthouse where this is coming down.